are the different phases. There's really a fourth phase that I'm going to cover on a totally separate session here. But the three main phases starts with phase number one, which is if you want to know how you know when someone is manipulating you, then it always start with what I call an emotional appeal. Maria Konnikova, she wrote this book called The Confidence Game. Fantastic book, by the way. And one of the things that she said in it was she said that at their root, magic tricks, which is what I was talking about before, and confidence games, like a con artist, a con man, con woman would use, they share the same fundamental principle. Their goal is to manipulate our beliefs. They're trying to get us to believe something that is not real or manipulate what we believe to be true. So con artists realize that the beliefs of people are more malleable. You can change somebody's belief if they're in a heightened state of emotion. So if you think about it, when you get really, really, really angry, we really don't think rationally. I mean, as an example, I mean, I have on a very, very, very rare occasion seen my sweet, lovable, amiable wife get so angry that she does something extremely out of character. Now, forget that oftentimes when these anger sessions occur, it's because I've done something that I shouldn't have done, right? Just that's beside the point. That doesn't make any difference here. But what happens though is that sweet, lovable, amiable people can act out of character if there's a lot of emotion involved. So there's this interesting type of psychology. It's called neuro-linguistic programming. You may have heard of it before, NLP. It's a fascinating study of human behavior and persuasion. And although the study is really, really complex, there are a few basic concepts that are important. By the way, I'm not an expert. This is not my thing, but I study it a lot. I do come across it, especially in writing persuasive articles and stuff like that. But the first of the things that I've kind of figured out about NLP that's kind of common, no matter who you're learning it from or who is practicing it, is that people like, and they are also attracted to people who are like them, right? So manipulators often begin by doing things to kind of get in step or get in rapport with what they call their mark or their victim. The second thing that the manipulator will do is they try to put their victims into a state where they're more susceptible to suggestions. By the way, they call this state, they call it a trance, but don't let that term fool you. I mean, a lot of times when people hear that, you think of like I said, I'm old. I used to watch the Scooby-Doo cartoons on Saturday morning when I was a kid, and Scooby-Doo would always, if he was if he was pretending to be in a trance, he would be like a zombie type thing with his arms sticking out. It's nothing like that. There's nothing mystical about this. There's nothing spiritual about it. In fact, a better term, I think, to describe this versus trance or state would be like a daydream, right? If you think about those moments that you have where for just a second your mind totally wanders and it's forming images or it's forming a narrative, there's kind of a story going on in your head and you kind of forget where you're at the moment. Well, the mind tends to be very creative when it wanders. So if you've ever had one of those situations where you're kind of in the shower and your mind, you're maybe singing or something, and then all of a sudden a solution to a really tough problem just becomes obvious, you've experienced this phenomenon. It's one of those things that occurs to us very, very naturally. And a lot of times people who are manipulating other folks or con men, they know this. So they know that in this heightened state, any emotion will do, by the way. It could be anger, laughter, fear. Those are the ones that are most common, but it could be anything. It could be love or sadness or sorrow. But when you're in that state where you're really thinking a lot, your mind is kind of wandering and thinking about the emotion or creating that narrative in your mind, you're much more susceptible to a suggestion that somebody makes. And by the way, the easiest way to elicit a trance, a daydream, a state, whatever you want to call it, is to tell a narrative or a story, right? By the way, just to kind of step out of character here, This is actually one of the best persuasion techniques that you can use. And if you're trying to persuade somebody, if we're not trying to manipulate somebody, if we're trying to influence them in a positive way, if we're trying to get them to do something that's for their benefit, a lot of times a good technique to use is to start with a story or an example. I've been teaching this, by the way, in my public speaking classes and leadership classes for years. So there's nothing unethical or immoral about what I'm going to cover in the next couple of minutes anyway. It's what happens next that people do when they're trying to manipulate you. So let's kind of start with the easy part. With the easiest way to elicit a trance or a change in state anyway, that daydream, is to tell a narrative. For instance, if you've ever been watching a great movie, you get really involved, you're totally engrossed by it. If that's happened, you for that in that moment. You're no longer in the movie theater, or you're no longer sitting on your sofa. You're actually in that. Your mind is kind of taking you into the story. It happens, by the way, in movies. It also happens when you're reading a novel or listening to an audiobook. I find that happens a lot to me a lot. I get a lot of kind of work done when I'm on the road. If I'm driving, a long distance, and I put an audio book on, and it kind of kills two birds with one stone. So what happens is that story it captivates us. And even though our bodies are there, our minds are actually in the story. So if since that is an easy way to kind of open the door to manipulating someone, a lot of times these con people, these con artists will do that. They know that anecdotal stories work the same way that a movie does. So manipulators will often use a story of a single incident to get the listener or the person that they're trying to influence to believe that this single example is global. So human nature, we tend to believe that if we see something or if something has happened once, then it can obviously happen again, and it probably happens all the time, but we just don't know about it, right? I've given 6 total examples of videos. They're just excerpts of videos that show different politicians doing this. I picked Joe Biden and Donald Trump just because they're running right now. So I just kind of picked excerpts from each one of their last couple of or from their speeches anyway. One with Biden was really recent, was just in the last couple of days. The one with Trump, I found a better example from way back during the last campaign. But the Joe Biden example, last week, Biden was giving a speech, and in the speech he was talking about the coronavirus, and he basically tells a quick story about a girl named Kristen in Arizona whose father died from COVID. Now, obviously, it's a very, very sad story. And so as a result, he's using that as a way to kind of create that image in the mind of the audience, and he's attempting to try to persuade people that Trump hasn't handled the coronavirus thing well, right? President Trump, in the video that I shared with him, it was his 2016 acceptance speech at the Republican National Committee, and basically what he does is he tells a story about 3 mothers who each lost their children or children to violence on the border. And during the story, it's interesting the way that he reinforces the emotion. He emphasizes the emotion because he interrupts himself and he says, "Hey, in all my travels in this country, nothing has effectively moved me more." And then he interrupts himself again. He says, "Not even close. I tell you, I can tell you." And so basically, what he's doing is he's exemplifying, he's exaggerating maybe not exaggerating, but he's calling attention to that emotion even more. So once the victim, the person who's being manipulated, is in the emotional state, the next thing that the manipulator will try to do is they'll try to create an anchor. They're trying to create a trigger to get the person to experience that emotion at a future time. So this kind of really goes back to over 100 years. In the 1890s, there was a Russian psychologist, Ivan Pavlov, and he conducted an experiment with his dog. You've probably heard the story before, Pavlov's dogs, right? Basically, in summary, here's what he did. He noticed that every time that he walked into the room where his dogs were and he had their bowls with him, the dog's mouth would start watering. He theorized that the vision of the bowls was it was like a trigger. It was an anchor to let them know that the food was coming. So he performed an experiment to see if he could add a new trigger to see if it will work as well as the visual image. And so what he started doing was that every time he would bring the dogs their food, he would ring a bell just before he fed them every single day. And it created a new anchor. It created this new trigger. So whenever he rang the bell, the dog's mouth started watering. And by the way, it would occur even if he didn't have the food with him, even if he didn't feed them right away, the dog's mouth would start to water because they were associating the ringing of that bell with, hey, we're about to get fed, right? So these anchors themselves, by the way, just like the stories that we told before, the anchors themselves are neither good nor bad. If a person understands how to use them, though, he or she can use those anchors that they set to manipulate other people into having feelings about certain things, or in a lot of cases, people. For instance, I'll give you a personal example of how I've used this for the positive. I recently noticed that really since COVID hit that I've gained quite a few pounds, like 15 plus. And I'm getting dressed the other day. I'm putting on my pants and as I kind of buckled my belt or buckled my pants anyway, I kind of noticed that my waist kind of rolled over my belt a little bit, and knowing how anchors work, I mean, at that moment, I was in it was like, I mean, I was disgusted with myself. I was like, oh, God, how can you let this happen? Right? Man, you were doing so well. You were getting so skinny again. It's almost like you're in college. I was not that close, but I was moving in that direction anyway. So what I did though was I took a close-up photo of my belt line. By the way, don't show anybody this. This is for your own personal benefit. If you take a picture like that, you will gross the heck out of people if you do this kind of thing. But what I did was I made the photo my phone wallpaper, like the lock wallpaper. So anytime I got an email or a text message or something like that, it kind of pops up on the screen. And and so I was looking at that sometimes 15, 20, 30 times a day. And throughout the time that I had that on, every time that I craved a sweet, I would just kind of trigger my phone and have it turn on. And I would quickly lose my appetite because it really is grotesque, by the way. After a couple of days, though, the anchor was set. I didn't need the photo anymore. I wasn't cheating like I had been for the past 6 or 7 months. And by the way, a few of the speeches that I talked about in the show notes, they have what we call auditory anchors, kind of like the Pavlov's bell, anchored in the story. For instance, when Joe Biden he ends by saying, Kristen said her dad's only pre-existing condition was trusting Donald Trump. So basically, when he's just doing that, he's anchoring the COVID deaths to Donald Trump. He's trying to associate President Trump with the deaths. Romney did the same thing back when he ran against Obama. He said, "I wish President Obama had succeeded because I want America to succeed." And what he was doing was he was anchoring the bad economy that was going on at the time to Obama's policies. And so a lot of politicians do this. And again, there's a fine line if you are doing these things. There's a fine line between trying to persuade people and influencing people and manipulating them, and it's really determined a lot by if you're using deception to create that behavior change. So kind of remember the karma there, right? So if all they're doing is this, it doesn't really rise to the evilness of manipulation. I mean, everything so far is really in line with persuasion, influence. But again, this is just phase one of the manipulation. This is something that's fairly common, and most of us do these kind of things naturally. It's what happens next that determines whether or not you're going to be manipulated. By the way, if you've never studied this kind of stuff, if you've never studied persuasion techniques or manipulation techniques or how to keep from being manipulated, you're probably thinking, oh, come on, telling a story and then blaming the results of that story on your opponent, that's never going to work. And in most cases, you're going to be right. A lot of times it takes a constant repetition in order to make that anchor work really well. So going back to my, my not cheating on my snacks, the first time I saw that picture, well, didn't, it wasn't really as impactful, but man, after I saw that like 30 times in a day, I mean, every time I'm seeing it, I'm getting more angry. I'm getting more, I mean, it's the emotion is kind of hitting me, right? So I'm going back into that state, that daydreaming moment, right? Just kind of keep that in mind. The high emotional state, it's really just the first phase. One of my favorite movies though was Dirty Rotten Scoundrels with Steve Martin. Oh yeah, some of these, it's hilarious. It's really funny, and it's got lots of twists and turns and that kind of thing. So it makes it fun. But in the excerpt that I put into the show notes, if you get a chance to watch it, pay attention to the multiple instances of high emotion, what I was just talking about. Because first, the characters, the manipulators, it's a team of con artists and con men that are manipulating what they call the mark, right? The person who is being manipulated. And basically the one of the characters, Robert Redford, and the person, the mark, the person who's being manipulated, end up foiling an armed robbery. And then so basically that's a pretty emotional type of incident, right? So there was a weapon involved and somebody got stabbed and there was a robbery, and so there was crime. So that's a pretty high emotional moment already. That is starting the quote unquote narrative. Then the victim, right, the person who is and then after that, so basically once the robbery is foiled, the person who is the mark, the person who is being manipulated, ends up with the guy's wallet. The robber drops it during the scuffle, and this guy picks it up and brings it back. And when he hands the wallet back to the victim, the so-called victim anyway, who's actually one of the con men, he opens up the wallet and there's just a ton of cash. There's like $5,000 in cash. And this was back in the 70s. Well, this would have been back in the 1930s, I think, was when the movie was set. So that's a lot of $5,000 back then is a huge amount of money, right? And so then so that's another high. So basically they're pushing the emotion up every time one of these new instances occur. The emotion starts to kick up a little bit. And then the person who is the victim tells the bystander that he's going to be killed if this huge stack of money that the person just got a glance of isn't dropped off to a mob house. And then so basically the story now is being involved. And then during the moment that Robert Redford, who's in on the con, ends up stealing or switching the money from the person who was getting swindled, the victim rants about how the only reason he's late getting this payment to the mob boss is that his wife has been sick and his kids have been sick, and and he's about to go bankrupt and all this. So he's basically telling story. He's giving a narrative. He's giving a story in order to kind of keep that emotion. So all of that, the whole scene shows how emotion influences the behavior of the bystander, the mark, right? Because this guy ends up giving all of his money to a complete stranger, even if it's just for a second. But that's a totally irrational behavior. Nobody in their right mind would do that. But because of the emotional state and because of the trust that was being kind of built in that moment with the swindlers, he does it, and he ends up doing it out of fear, by the way.